The two white men stepped onto the porch, clipboards in hand and practiced smiles ready. "Routine inspection," one said, eyeing the gate like it already belonged to him. They saw only an old black woman living alone in a quiet town no one would defend. She didn't argue. She took note. 3 nights later, they came back without clipboards. What they didn't know was that the woman they targeted had a son trained in places where justice was taken, not requested. When Isaiah Bell returned and read her final message, the town's silence ended, and the reckoning quietly began. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. The soil along the porch steps had always taken a little more convincing, the earth packed tighter, shaded longer, as if it needed extra reassurance before giving anything back. Yet even there, beneath the stubborn weight of clay and shadow, Esther Bell knelt with the quiet patience of someone who knew how to wait. Her knees, cushioned by the faded green pad she'd cut from an old chair cushion years ago, settled into place with the familiar grace of ritual. She worked with slow hands, fingers pressed gently into the dirt, turning it over, loosening it just enough to breathe. She didn't speak, didn't hum. Not today. Only listened to the hush of wind across the garden fence and the distant trill of mockingbirds that had made their home in the pecan trees near the road. The air smelled of wet soil and soft green leaves, not yet scorched by the full summer sun, and as she leaned back to wipe her brow with the sleeve of her cardigan, Esther's eyes settled on the small clump of buds nestled low in the hydrangea bush. They'd been slow to bloom this year, and she'd worried the frost had stolen them altogether. But now, at last, they were opening, pale violet, edged with silver, curling shyly toward the light like something sacred had survived despite the cold. She studied them for a long moment before standing slowly, her back stiff, her weight shifting cautiously as her joints reminded her that nothing moved as easily as it once had. She dusted her palms off against her apron, the blue fabric smudged with soil and time, then stepped carefully onto the porch and reached for the phone she'd left charging just inside the screen door. Her glasses waited beside the charger, always in the same spot, so she wouldn't misplace them. Slipping them on, she opened the camera, turned the phone toward the blossoms, and snapped a picture from just the right angle, framing the edge of the porch and the warm light falling across the wood like memory itself had come to sit beside her. With practiced fingers, she tapped the message field and typed slowly, adding a heart before she hit send. Hydrangeas finally came in. "Wish you were here to see it, baby." Miles away, beneath a different sun, Isaiah Bell sat on the edge of a narrow cot inside a steel-walled bunker where names were replaced with numbers, and silence was the only language spoken with trust. His boots rested in the dirt, worn from a terrain that didn't belong to him, the laces streaked with the kind of dust that clung to everything, uniforms, weapons, skin, and never truly washed off. The mission was done, the final sweep complete, and yet none of them moved with ease. Around him, the others packed gear with robotic focus, checking weapons and zipping bags without conversation, the kind of silence forged not from calm, but exhaustion, buried under discipline. Isaiah leaned forward, elbows on knees, scrolling absently through the cracked screen of his phone, the glass smudged with the dirt of the last 12 hours. 3 messages, one from command, coordinates for debrief, buried in encryption, another from a fellow operative, something about heading stateside, and the third, from her. He tapped it without thinking. The image took its time, buffering on a weak signal until the hydrangeas finally bloomed into view. His mother had centered the blossoms in the frame, soft lavender petals folded like paper prayers, with a sliver of the porch railing casting a diagonal line through the background. Below the photo, her message sat quietly, waiting for acknowledgement. He read it twice. A faint smile pressed into the corner of his mouth, gone as quickly as it came. He started to type something back, then stopped. A shout echoed down the corridor, his name called sharply, urgently. He pocketed the phone and stood, slinging his pack over one shoulder with the reflex of muscle memory, not emotion. He told himself he'd reply after wheels up, after the dust settled, after the next round of silence. Back in the kitchen, Esther set the phone down on the counter, her glasses beside it, then reached for the kettle and moved with slow precision through her morning routine. One tea bag into her favorite cup, the one with the chipped rim and faded violets along the edge, one cube of sugar. One hand pressed lightly to the Bible that remained open near the windowsill. The kettle clicked off, steam rising in curls as she poured, her gaze drifting through the kitchen window that framed the gravel road beyond her yard. Across the street, a white utility truck had pulled just past the oak trees that marked the boundary of her land, its engine humming low, steady, with a presence too deliberate to be casual. She narrowed her eyes, watching without leaning too far forward, and waited. No one got out. No one moved. The engine purred, then stopped. Still holding the kettle, she stepped away from the window and let the curtain fall gently back into place. Her breath was slow but shallow now, like the feeling that had settled over the town had finally seeped through her screen door. Something was wrong. Not loud, not sudden, just wrong. Like a house that had grown unfamiliar despite never changing. She stirred her tea and set the spoon down perfectly straight on the saucer. Her hands moved from habit, not hunger. Her lips parted in a quiet breath, the edges of a prayer forming silently in her chest, not yet spoken. Outside, the first breeze of morning brushed against the new blooms, swaying the hydrangeas gently as if trying to call her back to them. Inside, the air stilled. And far from home, Isaiah walked into a new assignment, unaware that the last message his mother had sent him would be the one he'd never answer. Lately, there had been a feeling Esther couldn't quite name, something that hummed beneath the stillness of her street, subtle but insistent, like a note held too long in the wrong key. The days moved the same. The birds still nested in the pecan trees, and the mail still came at 11:30. But something in the rhythm of the neighborhood had shifted. Conversations with neighbors had grown shorter, more watchful. The white couple down the road had begun parking their truck across their driveway instead of beside it, angled deliberately toward the street like a barrier. Young men she didn't recognize rode through on bicycles at odd hours, never waving, never looking her way. It wasn't a loud change, but it was present, steady, like the chill before a storm that hasn't yet touched the ground. The sound came just after noon. 3 sharp knocks, quick and clipped. No hesitation between them. Esther had been in the den, folding linens with the radio humming low in the background, the preacher's voice trailing off into a gospel song she didn't quite know. She paused, hands resting on a warm towel pulled fresh from the dryer, and turned toward the front of the house. The knocks came again, softer this time, but still clear, not the kind of knock that belonged to a neighbor or the mailman. She walked slowly, not out of fear, but because life had taught her to look carefully before rushing to meet anything. The screen door creaked as she pushed it open, and through the glass she saw them. 2 white men in matching orange safety vests and pale beige ball caps, standing just off the steps with clipboards in hand, and practiced, neighborly smiles. One was tall with a thick neck and a jaw that looked like it had once belonged to a boxer. The other was thinner, almost wiry, with pale eyes that didn't quite settle in one place. They both stood a little too straight, as if rehearsed, their presence at ease in a way that made her bones tighten. "Afternoon, ma'am," the taller one said, tipping his cap slightly. "Sorry to bother you. We're with County Utilities. Got a report about a possible power irregularity on this line. Maybe some surging in the last few days? Flickering lights? Outages?" Esther didn't answer right away. She looked past them toward the truck parked just at the curve in the road. It had no logo, just a dull white cab and a rusted bumper. "My light's been fine," she said finally, her voice calm but flat. "Ain't had no flickering." The wiry one smiled wider. "Could be upstream, hard to say. We're doing some meter reads in the area, making sure things line up before we roll a bigger crew out. Mind if we just have a look around back? Won't be long." Her hand tightened slightly on the edge of the doorframe. She didn't step back, didn't open the screen. "You don't usually need to look in people's backyards to read a meter." The tall one laughed softly, holding up the clipboard like it proved something. "It's a new process, pre-inspection. We won't touch anything, promise." Esther kept her eyes on him. His hands were clean, no calluses, no dust, the kind of hands that hadn't spent real time doing outdoor work. "What's your name?" she asked. The man blinked. "I'm Rob. This here's Kenny." "And your ID?" she said, already knowing the answer. The wiry one, Kenny, shifted slightly. "Oh, we don't usually carry—" "Then I don't usually open my gate," she said, and began to close the door. The taller one held up a hand, not quite touching the screen but close enough to make her still. "Ma'am, we understand. Lot of scams going around these days, sure. But we're legit. Here." He reached slowly into his vest pocket, pulled out a folded piece of paper, and held it up against the glass. "Here's the inspection request. Came through dispatch just this morning." She stared at the paper but didn't reach for it. "I'll call the office myself if I need confirmation," she said, voice low. The tall man nodded. "Of course. We'll just move on to the next." "No trouble." The men stepped back in unison, their movements fluid, too clean, like they'd trained for this moment. Esther watched them return to the truck. They didn't rush, didn't speak. Just got in, started the engine, and drove off without turning around. She didn't move until the sound of gravel faded completely. When she finally locked the door and returned to the den, the linen on the chair had cooled. She sat slowly, one hand still resting on her knee, the other picking up the notepad she kept beside the phone for grocery lists and sermon quotes. She wrote down the time, their names, their description, and the color of the truck. She circled the words "No ID" twice, then underlined them. That night, as the sun dipped behind the trees and the porch lights clicked on, she made a cup of tea and stood by the front window for a long time, watching the road. The breeze had gone still, and even the mockingbirds were quiet. She didn't feel fear. She'd lived too long, seen too much to give herself over to that. But unease had found its way inside her house and settled like dust along the baseboards. She took her phone from the counter, opened the message thread with Isaiah, and typed slowly. 2 men came today. Said they were from the power company. No ID. Said something about checking the line. I didn't let them in. Just thought I should tell you. She hovered over the send button, reread the message, then hit it. The screen blinked once, confirming delivery. No read receipt, just the gray check mark, and silence. Far away, Isaiah was beneath fluorescent lights in a makeshift debrief tent. His phone silenced in the side pocket of his gear bag, forgotten in the rhythm of orders and names, none of which included hers. Esther placed the phone face down on the counter and locked every door in the house, double-checking the back door twice. In her room, she placed her notepad beside the Bible, folded her cardigan at the edge of the bed, and lay down fully clothed, the faintest flicker of tension still resting behind her eyes. In the quiet, she whispered another prayer, though this one had no words, just the steady, pulsing hope that someone, somewhere, was listening. The days stretched uneventful in the way danger often does before it breaks open, silent and patient, waiting for something to let its weight be felt. Esther kept to her routine, though her eyes lingered longer on the windows now, and her walks to the mailbox grew slower, more deliberate, with her head gently turning as she scanned the street, with an attention she hadn't needed to use in years. Her neighbors didn't seem to notice. Mr. Lancaster mowed his yard on Saturday like always. Miss Pauline waved from her porch swing. Her tiny dog curled up beside her like nothing in the world had shifted. But Esther knew better. Something in the air had changed, the kind of stillness that came before a heavy wind. It was on the third night after the first visit, just past 10, long after the porch light had flicked on and the street had gone quiet, that she heard them again. This time, there was no knock. It began with the crunch of gravel near the side fence, not loud, but purposeful. She had been sitting in her bedroom, her Bible open on her lap, rereading a passage in Psalms about deliverance, her glasses balanced low on her nose. The sound pulled her upright. Her breath caught before her body moved. She didn't turn on the light. She knew better than to give herself away with shadow. Instead, she rose slowly, her bare feet silent against the floorboards, and moved to the edge of the curtain by the side window. In the pale glow of the porch light, she saw them. Same two men. No safety vests this time. No clipboards. No smiles. The taller one walked along the side of the house with a flashlight angled low, as if pretending to check something. The wiry one lingered near the edge of the back gate, his head tilted like he was listening. Neither spoke. They moved like they'd already made up their minds. Esther's hand trembled slightly as she reached for her phone. No service. Just the spinning circle of a failed connection, and the quiet realization that she might be standing alone in more ways than one. The men began circling. They didn't come to the door. Didn't bother with pretenses. The flashlight passed by her kitchen window, paused, then moved again. A rattle came from the back gate latch. She could hear it jiggling, metal against metal, soft but insistent. She backed away from the window, moved through the darkened hallway toward the kitchen, stopping just long enough to retrieve her notepad from the counter and tuck it under her arm, as if it were a shield. In the living room, she flicked off the last light. Only the small lamp beside the hallway remained glowing, and she turned that one off too. The house sank into darkness. The rattling stopped. And then, a different sound. The soft scrape of something metal, dragging lightly across glass. She tightened her grip on the phone. Still no signal. She remembered the old landline, buried in the hall closet behind her sewing things, disconnected years ago. She cursed under her breath and moved instead to the bedroom, reaching for the photograph of Isaiah that stood beside her alarm clock. Him in uniform, standing straight-backed in front of a row of tents. The same slight tilt of the mouth that never quite became a smile. She clutched it tightly. She didn't cry. She sat on the edge of her bed and whispered a prayer, this time not just for strength or wisdom, but for time, for delay, for whoever was outside her house to find nothing worth continuing. Outside, the flashlight moved past her bedroom window once more, slower this time, like a question being asked. Then, finally, footsteps. Gravel shifting again, quieter, retreating. They were leaving. She didn't move until she heard the engine start. The headlights never came on. The truck backed down the road with its lights off, disappearing around the corner like something slipping beneath the surface of water. She stayed where she was for a long time after that, her hands folded tightly around the photograph, her eyes open, unfocused. It was nearly 2 a.m. before she stood again, crept to the window, and peeked out one last time. Nothing. She walked to the kitchen in silence and wrote everything down. The time, the route they took around the house, the gate latch, the flashlight, the lack of vests, the expressions on their faces. She wrote it all as if documenting the last hours of something sacred, as if the act of writing it could somehow protect her. She did not send Isaiah another message. She told herself he was busy, that he would read the last one, that he would call when he could. Far from home, Isaiah crouched in the shadow of a cargo bay, his rifle slung low, dirt caked across his cheek and collar, as the plane vibrated under him. Extraction was coming. He could hear the idle chatter of the other soldiers, low voices, clipped, the way people talked after a job they didn't want to remember. His body ached from the sprint, the drag, the fire. His hand moved unconsciously to his vest pocket, fingers brushing the phone but never pulling it out. There would be time later. For now, the mission wasn't over. Back home, Esther folded her notepad closed, placed it beneath her Bible again, and lay down once more. She left the lamp off. She didn't undress. She simply pulled the covers to her chin and closed her eyes. The photo of her son stayed on the pillow beside her. And somewhere outside, beyond the still curtains and the silvered glow of moonlight on glass, the night breathed quietly, watchful, waiting. It came not as a surprise, but as confirmation, proof that what had quietly crept through her bones was real, no longer a shadow on the edge of thought, but a shape taking form in the late afternoon light. The sun slanted low across the porch where Esther sat in silence, her tea untouched on the arm of the chair, her cardigan sleeves pulled down to her wrists despite the warmth. The hydrangeas near her feet had bloomed fully now, their petals thick with color, fragile in the way only things born too late in the season tend to be. Her hands, folded in her lap, rested atop her notepad, though she hadn't written anything since morning. She simply watched the road. The truck came back. Same make, same rusted bumper. Only now, it bore a magnetic sign affixed clumsily to the side panel that read County Power Services, the letters peeling at the edges. The ruse was worse than before. Too clean, too sudden, like a costume worn by someone who didn't know how to play the part. The two men stepped out, as if summoned by the very silence of the street. Their uniforms neater, pressed in a way that suggested effort without knowledge. One held a clipboard again, held high like a flag of harmless intention, while the other's hands were empty and relaxed at his sides, though his knuckles flexed with an energy that did not belong to any honest worker. Esther did not stand. She waited. "Afternoon again, ma'am," the tall one called out, his voice too cheerful, too wide in tone to be natural. "Apologies again. Brought the proper paperwork this time. Just want to drop it off and finish our check. Won't take long." She said nothing. Her gaze drifted to the truck, then to the sidewalk, then to the garden hose curled loosely by the porch steps. "We've got a request from dispatch." "Real formal this time," the wiry one added, lifting the clipboard as if its presence erased memory. "Thought you'd appreciate that. Should clear up any confusion." Her fingers tightened slightly around the notepad, but she didn't reach for the cane beside her. Her voice, when it came, was quiet, but unwavering. "I told you once already. This house don't need checking. You can leave your paper on the step." "Totally understandable," said the tall one, nodding, stepping forward in a manner that seemed casual but wasn't. "We'll leave it right here and be on our way." He mounted the steps too quickly. She pushed herself up from the chair. The second man moved around the side of the porch as if to circle her, and something in Esther's chest folded inward, the body knowing before the mind could fully articulate it. She reached for the door. Too late. The first man surged forward, driving his shoulder into the screen before she could close it, the door snapping open with a sound that split the air. Wood cracked, the latch gave, and the weight of them entered her space before she could catch her breath. She cried out and staggered back, catching the edge of the door frame with one hand while swinging the notepad with the other. It struck the man's face with the weight of desperation, not force, and fell to the floor without a sound. The tall one cursed under his breath, shoved her backward, and caught her arm just below the shoulder as if he'd done this before, as if he already knew where to grab, and how tightly. "I said stay still," he muttered, and she tried to twist away. Her elbow jabbed up toward his ribs, her cane forgotten near the porch. The wiry one slipped through the side door, now ajar from the force of their entry, and together they cornered her in the narrow hallway, pinning her between the wall and the kitchen threshold. She fought with the kind of strength that comes not from youth or training, but from knowing that if you give in now, there won't be another chance. She clawed at their faces, tore at the buttons on their shirts, and screamed, a high, ragged sound that cracked and grew louder the more they tried to silence it. Her nails left red marks. Her voice rose again. "Get out of my house!" she shouted, even as they pushed her into the dining room table, sending her framed photographs clattering to the floor. "We ain't here to steal," the wiry one said through gritted teeth, not even trying to mask the contempt in his voice, just cleaning up what should have been cleared out already. "This is my home," she rasped, reaching for the drawer by the kitchen counter. The taller man slammed it shut before she could open it. Not for long. They dragged her across the room, her feet kicking over the rug, knocking aside the small wooden stand that had once held her Bible. She swung wildly at the thinner man and caught him in the chin. He struck her back, once, hard, across the cheek. Her knees buckled. She fell, not crumpled, but on purpose, reaching for the floor lamp behind her. The blow came down again. Outside, a neighbor across the street paused mid-step, groceries hanging from her arm. She looked toward the house. A scream, a scuffle. The porch in disarray. But then she turned, eyes lowered, hurrying inside with her head bowed. The curtain slid closed. Inside, the flower vase shattered. Water spread across the hardwood, soaking into the rug, washing against the corners of family pictures now scattered and broken. One photo landed face up. Isaiah, young, uniformed, smiling faintly in the sunlight. Esther tried to reach for it. The tall man's boot came down on her wrist. She bit her lip to keep from crying out again, her body still resisting, refusing to yield to the bruising weight of their assault, even as the force of them continued to overwhelm the space around her. The sharp pain radiating through her limbs did not stop her from trying to twist away, nor did the blood now trailing from her temples silence the voice in her that told her to fight until her very last breath. Her fingers reached instinctively toward the floor, toward the glimmer of her phone half hidden beneath the edge of the armchair, as if its familiar weight might still offer a chance to be heard, to reach someone, anyone, before it was too late. But just as her fingertips brushed the corner of the device, the taller man caught her wrist and slammed it against the floor with such brute force that the pain ricocheted through her shoulder, sending her vision blurring at the edges. The phone skidded further out of reach, disappearing beneath the chair in a scrape of plastic and silence. Still, Esther refused to stay down. Her elbow flared up toward the man's ribs, connecting with a dull thud that made him grunt. Not from injury, but from surprise. His reaction was immediate and vicious. He grabbed the collar of her sweater and dragged her roughly across the floor, her heels scraping against the rug, the fibers catching the soles of her slippers as she struggled to find footing, to anchor herself against the force that kept pulling her further from everything she knew. Her hand swung wildly, catching the edge of a photo frame on the table, sending it crashing to the ground. She tried to cry out again, but the sound tangled in her throat as the taller man shoved her once more against the base of the couch. Her ribs struck the wood with a heavy crack, and this time her breath vanished altogether. Her body sagged for a moment, but not from surrender. She was only gathering what little strength she had left. "My son," she rasped, voice gritty with pain and rising from somewhere deeper than her lungs. "My son's military. He's trained. He'll come back and find out what you did." There was no hesitation in her voice, no wavering plea, only the unflinching truth of a mother who believed in the man she had raised and who clung to the hope that speaking his name might stop what was already in motion. But the taller man looked down at her, unmoved, his face expressionless as he crouched beside her and leaned in so close she could feel the heat of his breath against her cheek. The stink of cigarettes and sweat made her eyes water. but she didn't look away. "Lady," he said, his tone void of care, "you think anybody out here gives a damn who your boy is? He ain't here now, is he? And when we're done, he won't find nothing worth coming back for." He stood and pressed his knee into her lower back, forcing her face into the rug as he turned his head toward the hallway. "Take whatever looks good," he called out. "Clean it out." The wiry man, already halfway through her bedroom, responded with a careless laugh that carried no real amusement, only the thrill of control. He was rummaging through her drawers, tearing open the lining of her jewelry box, his boots stomping through the delicate folds of scarves she had worn to church. When he opened her closet, he ripped dresses from hangers, as if punishing fabric for having once belonged to someone proud. "Not much here," he called back, his voice echoing faintly through the walls. "Just costume jewelry and some old coins. Grab it anyway. She won't miss it," the taller one replied, still holding Esther down, his weight making it nearly impossible to draw breath. Her chest rose and fell in short, trembling bursts as she tried to move again, to twist her body just enough to shift the balance, to make them underestimate her one last time. She reached blindly toward the couch leg, trying to pull herself forward inch by inch, but the effort only caused her body to scream louder in protest. Her arms trembled beneath her, her legs useless from the strikes she had taken already. She could see the corner of Isaiah's photograph now, its frame cracked from the earlier struggle but still intact, lying just within reach on the floor. She tried to stretch toward it, not because it would stop them, not because it held any magic power, but because it was his, and in the absence of his voice or his arms or the sound of his footsteps on the porch, it was the only part of him she had left to hold on to. The wiry one returned from the hallway with a bag, now half full of her belongings: photo albums, a pair of small kitchen appliances, a bundle of letters tied in ribbon, and the little metal box she had kept at the back of the pantry for emergencies. He glanced down at her as he passed. "She still movin'?" he asked flatly. The taller man didn't answer right away. Instead, he leaned forward and stared at her face as her eyes blinked slowly, barely able to hold focus. "She's almost done," he muttered, his voice stripped of anything human. Then, in one final motion, he drew back and slammed his fist into her chest with the kind of force that doesn't come from impulse, but from decision. Esther gasped. Her body jerked once. The wiry man dropped the bag on the couch and reached for the broken leg of the chair that had splintered near the entryway. "Just finish it," he said. "She ain't worth jail time." He walked away before it happened. One step, then another, and behind him, the dull final sound of wood striking flesh echoed once, then twice, then no more. Outside, the porch light flickered slightly in the wind, casting long shadows over the crushed hydrangeas that now lay torn and wilted beneath bootprint. A few petals clung to the air, carried briefly across the yard before landing silently in the gravel. Across the street, behind a drawn curtain, a neighbor peeked out once, saw the truck parked in the driveway, saw the flickering light, saw the stillness that followed, then pulled the curtain shut again without saying a word. Inside, the house settled. The silence that came after was not peace, and it was not sleep. It was erasure. Esther Bell lay motionless on the floor of her living room, her blood seeping into the fibers of the rug beneath her, her hand still reaching toward the photo of her son that now lay face up beside her elbow, untouched but smeared faintly with red. Under the armchair, her phone lit up once, vibrating softly in the quiet as a call came through. The name on the screen pulsed softly, Isaiah Bell, but she did not reach for it, and no one else would. The call failed to connect. Somewhere across the ocean, Isaiah glanced down at the screen of his phone during the final minutes of debrief, his hands still calloused from the operation, his body sore from the weight of armor, and long nights spent crouched behind silence and orders. The name on the screen had flickered, Mama, then vanished before he could unlock it. He had frowned slightly, assuming it was a dropped signal or a missed check-in. His team leader had called his name just then, pulling him back into the noise of wrapping up, and like so many things in war, the message slipped quietly into the backlog of what he would get to later. But something about the missed call stayed with him, a knot that didn't settle in his gut, the kind that doesn't make a sound but doesn't leave either. By the time they boarded the extraction flight, the sky had already dimmed. The base faded beneath them, and the wheels lifted into that gray space where past and present start to blur. Isaiah sat by the window, eyes unfocused, as he finally opened his messages. Her last text. Hydrangeas finally came in. Wish you were here to see it, baby. Had gone unanswered. The next message, short and more urgent. 2 men came today. Said they were from the power company. No ID. I didn't let them in. Just thought I should tell you. Had never even been read. He reread it twice, then checked the timestamp. The air in his chest thinned. He didn't wait for wheels to touch the ground. He called home from the layover. No answer. He called again when they landed. Nothing. Then he called the church. The pastor didn't answer either, but the voice that did was trembling. That was how he found out. Not from his commanding officer. Not from a red-stamped report. Not even from a neighbor. It was a junior secretary at the church office who stammered through the words as gently as she could, telling him that the funeral had already happened, that it had all been very sudden, that the arrangements had been made quickly, and that everything had been taken care of. Isaiah didn't ask what that meant. He simply ended the call and rented the first car he could find, a dusty black sedan with a faulty air conditioner and a half-full tank. The drive home passed in fragments, his hands clenched on the steering wheel, the roads both familiar and alien, the kind of stretch that never changes but still manages to feel wrong when something has been taken from it. The late summer heat hung heavy through the windshield, and the gravel roads leading back to the house curled like veins through a land that no longer felt like it belonged to anyone. When he pulled into the driveway, it wasn't the sight of the house that struck him first. It was the absence. The porch where she used to sit with her tea and her cardigan was bare. The garden beds she had tended with quiet devotion were stripped. The hydrangeas nowhere to be seen. A single weed grew up through the stone where the hose used to coil. The windows were closed, the blinds drawn, the screen door left crooked on its hinge like someone had opened it too quickly and never bothered to fix it. The front door was unlocked. Isaiah pushed it open slowly, and the air that greeted him smelled faintly of bleach, dust, and something gone. The walls had been wiped clean. The floor had been swept. Everything looked as if it had been arranged by people who knew nothing about the woman who once moved through this space with care and purpose. The family photos were missing. The Bible was no longer on the side table. The radio no longer played the gospel station. Her blue sweater, always left draped on the edge of the couch, was gone, replaced by nothing but the ghost of habit. On the kitchen counter sat a folder with his name on it, taped shut, as if that was supposed to make anything right. He peeled it open. The documents inside were thin, clinical, and devoid of meaning. The sheriff's report stated that the case had been classified as a robbery gone wrong. No suspects had been detained. No witnesses had come forward. There were no known leads and no reason to suspect anything other than opportunistic crime. The scene had been secured. The valuables had been removed for inventory, though no inventory was enclosed. The wounds were mentioned only in passing. Minor contusions, evidence of struggle, unfortunate fatality. As if the life they described had only mattered in the way a broken window or a smashed clock might warrant mention in passing. The autopsy was worse. 1 page. Cold language. Cause of death. Blunt force trauma. Notes. Deceased found with defensive injuries consistent with resisting assault. No mention of time of death. No detail about the state of the house. No evidence gathered. No photographs. No apology. There had been a funeral, the papers said, held quietly, with a few members of the congregation present, arranged by the church board, closed casket, quick burial. Cemetery records indicated the plot had been donated. Her body had been put in the ground without him. He stood in the center of the living room, folder still in his hands, and looked around at the hollow shape of what had once been a home. The couch cushions were different. The rug was gone. The lamp had been replaced. Even the clock on the wall ticked a new rhythm, louder, out of place, like it had been hung by someone who just needed to make the room look full again. He crossed to the corner where her chair had always sat and knelt, brushing his fingers along the hardwood as if expecting to feel her presence there. But the floor was clean, too clean, bleached of everything, even memory. He stood slowly and walked outside. Across the street, someone pulled a curtain closed. Down the block, a car door shut, then restarted its engine without pause. He walked house to house, knocking, calm and deliberate, his presence alone enough to stir discomfort. 2 neighbors answered. One mumbled sympathy. The other said they didn't want to get involved. The rest did not open their doors at all. By the time he returned to the porch, the sun had nearly set. He stood there for a long while, one hand on the splintered rail, his eyes locked on the driveway where the tire tracks had never been brushed away. That night, he slept on the floor of the living room, beside the folder and the empty side table, facing the spot where the picture of him had once stood. He didn't move. He didn't cry. He didn't pray. He simply lay still, eyes open, waiting for the sun to rise. And when it did, he rose too. Not as a son mourning a mother, but as a soldier returning to a war that had come home in his absence. The morning light filtered slowly through the window panes, draping across the floor in streaks of pale gold that did not warm the space so much as illuminate its emptiness. The living room, stripped of photographs and memory, sat untouched since the previous day, its hollow quiet interrupted only by the subtle groan of the house settling under the weight of something that no longer lived there. Isaiah remained still for several minutes after waking, lying flat on his back in the very center of the room, his eyes open and fixed on the ceiling, his arms resting loosely at his sides, the same position he had fallen into when night took him, not from sleep, but from exhaustion and restraint. There was no plan in those early hours, only a choice. He stood slowly, joints stiff from the hardwood floor, and moved through the house not as a visitor, but as someone reclaiming something that had been taken. His mother's bedroom remained just as cold and cleared as the rest, her closet door slightly ajar, revealing only hangers and a box of church hats stacked neatly like forgotten crowns. Isaiah opened the old cedar trunk at the foot of her bed and found it mostly empty, save for a folded flag from his father's funeral and a stack of letters wrapped in twine, their corners yellowed and soft with age. He didn't touch them. Not yet. By late morning, he drove into town in the same rental sedan, its interior still warm from the sun and faintly scented with cracked leather and old pine air freshener. He did not stop at the store. He did not pass through the church. He drove straight to the sheriff's department, pulling into a half-full parking lot where the flag on the pole barely stirred in the breeze. The office inside was modest, 3 desks, 2 filing cabinets, and a wall covered in a corkboard with notices no one had read in weeks. The woman at the front desk greeted him with the same practiced smile she had likely offered to every passerby who walked through that door. She glanced at his name, recognized it, and her smile faltered slightly before gesturing toward the back office. Sheriff Wyatt Colton emerged a minute later, the creak of his belt audible as he adjusted it over his hips, his thumb hooked casually beneath the leather like he had nowhere else to be. He did not extend a hand in greeting, nor did he offer condolences. His tone was flat, casual in a way that felt rehearsed. "Figured you'd turn up eventually," he said, leaning against the doorframe like a man who had answered this kind of question before and didn't expect to answer it again. Isaiah held the folder under his arm, its contents still unchanged, still infuriatingly blank. "You want to tell me why your report reads like someone broke a window? Not a body?" The sheriff exhaled through his nose, a gesture that managed to sound both tired and mildly annoyed. "We did what we could with what we had. No signs of forced entry. No hard evidence of a struggle beyond what we documented. The place had already been disturbed before we got there. No cameras in the area. No reliable witnesses. We logged it, processed the scene, wrote it up. Sometimes these things happen." "She didn't just fall down, Sheriff," Isaiah said, his voice low and even, each word carefully controlled. "She fought." "Yeah," Colton replied with a shrug. "Old folks usually do. Doesn't change much in the end." Isaiah didn't blink. "You found her with bruises, broken ribs, blood on the rug, and you logged that as a routine robbery?" The sheriff tilted his head, still leaning comfortably against the frame. "Like I said, no suspects. No one saw anything. We've got 2 deputies and 50 miles of county to cover. Unless someone wants to talk, there's not much we can do. I've seen it before. You stick around long enough, you'll see it too." "Someone's seen something," Isaiah replied, voice harder now, though it never rose. Colton pushed off the frame, adjusted the brim of his hat, and glanced toward the hallway. "You can check in with me if you hear anything yourself, but I'd suggest letting the dust settle. Stirring things up won't bring her back." Isaiah stared at him long enough for the silence between them to stretch uncomfortably, then turned and walked out of the station without another word. He didn't slam the door. He didn't look back. He simply stepped into the heat of the afternoon and walked through it like it had no hold on him. The rest of the day passed with the same steady clarity. He visited each house on the block, knocking with patience, listening to the scrape of curtains being drawn back and the slow click of locks being turned behind doors that had once welcomed his mother with pies and polite conversation. Some opened only halfway. A few didn't open at all. The words they offered, if any, were hollow, crafted with care to say nothing of value. One neighbor spoke of how kind she had been. Another said it was a shame. A third said it was the world they lived in now, as if that excused everything. By dusk, Isaiah returned home with nothing useful. No names, no faces, no confessions, just the tightness in his chest that had only grown heavier with each unopened door. He walked through the house slowly, pausing in each room to scan the walls, the corners, the windows. He pulled down the attic stairs, climbed into the dry heat of the crawl space, and found the old footlocker she had kept tucked behind holiday boxes and worn luggage. The lock was old, but not rusted. He opened it and stared at what remained of the past life he had tried to forget. A combat knife, clean and sharp, a flashlight, a utility belt, civilian gear that looked like it had been left for someone who would one day return. He ran his hands over each piece, checking for wear, then laid them out on the bed in the room that no longer felt like his mother's, but had not yet become his. He did not eat that night. He did not speak. He only prepared. By the time the moon rose high over the yard and the breeze began to rustle the weeds where her garden once stood, Isaiah was already walking the length of the backyard, his boots silent on the soft earth. The flashlight beam cut through the dark like a needle, careful and precise, and the knife remained clipped to his belt. Not drawn, not brandished, but waiting. He moved through the property line and into the trees, scanning the woods with a hunter's stillness, following the fence that separated his family's land from the empty fields beyond. This wasn't grief. This was war, and the first step had already been taken. The road out of town curled through the woods like a lazy question, lined with cracked pavement and overgrown ditches, a place that hadn't seen repaving in years, but still carried the secrets of the people who used it after dark. Isaiah's truck, an old matte black F-150 he had traded his rental for in cash from a man who didn't ask why, moved without sound beneath him. The windows were down, the engine kept low. He wasn't driving fast. Speed was for people who didn't know what they were looking for. Isaiah did. He'd spent the last 3 days listening, not just to people, though that had offered nothing, but to patterns, truck schedules, gas station chatter, bar deliveries, empty stretches of road that suddenly saw movement at night. It was in a conversation outside a bait shop, between two men who didn't realize he was parked close enough to hear, that he caught the detail that mattered. Someone had been bragging about cleaning out another one of those places, and someone else had laughed and said, "That one didn't go easy." They didn't say her name. They didn't have to. The bar was a rusted, low-ceilinged shack pressed against the woods just off a forgotten side road, where the neon lights outside barely flickered anymore, and the parking lot was mostly gravel, stained with years of engine oil and cigarette ash. It sat like a wound left to fester, attracting the kind of men who worked without licenses, paid in cash, and bragged too loudly when they thought no one important was listening. Isaiah didn't go in. He waited outside in the truck, one hand resting against the steering wheel, the other holding the tattered notebook he had begun filling with names, descriptions, license plates, anything that moved wrong, looked wrong, or stood too close to memory. When he saw the man step out just after 11, beer in one hand, phone in the other, Isaiah didn't need confirmation. He knew by the posture, the way the man looked both relaxed and tense at once, as if still reliving something that made him feel powerful. His gait was the same as it had been in the footage Isaiah had recovered from a backlot security camera at a feed store down the block from his mother's street. Grainy, low quality, but enough to catch the signature limp and heavy left heel. The man leaned against a concrete pillar near the edge of the lot, lighting a cigarette with a plastic lighter and exhaling slowly into the humid night air, unaware that he was being watched. Isaiah didn't rush. He waited until the man began walking toward the truck parked at the end of the lot, his keys jingling loosely from a belt loop. Then he moved. He slipped out of the driver's seat, boots silent over gravel, the darkness folding around him like a second skin. He caught up to the man near the truck bed, his shadow long and quiet, until he was close enough to smell the alcohol on his breath and the dust in the folds of his shirt. "You left something behind." The man turned, confused at first, then wary, then something sharper. "I don't know you," he said, taking a half step back, his hand moving instinctively toward his waistband. Isaiah didn't give him the chance. The first blow landed clean against his gut, folding him forward without sound. The second came across his jaw, redirecting the momentum and sending him sprawling sideways into the bed of the truck. The cigarette flew from his fingers, the lighter clattering to the ground. Before the man could recover, Isaiah had already closed the distance, grabbed the collar of his shirt, and slammed him against the tailgate with a force that echoed into the trees. "You were at her house," the man gasped, one arm flailing, the other reaching behind him for something Isaiah had already taken. A folding knife now lying useless on the gravel. "I don't know what you're—" Isaiah drove his knee into the man's ribs with surgical precision, the impact not wild, but controlled, trained to rupture without killing. The man screamed, tried to twist away, but Isaiah's forearm pressed against his throat, pinning him like a board beneath weight. Her name was Esther Bell. "You remember her now?" "I don't. I swear to God!" Isaiah pressed harder, not enough to cut air entirely, just enough to remind him that lies wouldn't last long out here. "You and your partner wore vests, no IDs. You knew she was alone." "I wasn't there. I just heard—" The second rib snapped beneath pressure, and the man howled, slumping under Isaiah's grip. She was my mother, Isaiah said, voice quiet, eyes unflinching. So you're going to start telling me everything you know, every name, every place, and you're going to do it before I stop asking nicely. The man coughed hard, blood trailing from the corner of his mouth, his bravado gone now, replaced by something sharper than fear. Guilt. Not guilt for what had happened, but guilt that came from the realization that he'd survived it, and now someone had come to collect what had been left unpaid. "There's a warehouse," the man choked out, eyes squinting in pain. "Down off Route 9, behind the feed silos. Old grain depot. They meet there sometimes, stash stuff, wait out heat when something goes wrong." "Who's they?" "Don't know all the names. Just Clay runs it. Clay Barger. He runs the crew, picks targets, sends boys to pose as workers. Says old folks make the least noise." Isaiah pressed slightly harder, just long enough to make the man squirm before releasing him. The man crumpled to the ground, one arm clutching his ribs, his face drawn tight with pain and shame. "How many others?" Isaiah asked. The man didn't look up. "At least 3 I know of. Maybe more. Most don't fight back." Isaiah stared down at him for a long moment, the moonlight casting long lines across the gravel. His shadow stretched behind him like something separate. "Get up," he said finally. The man struggled to his feet, still hunched, still wheezing. "If I see you again," Isaiah continued, "if I hear your name attached to another house, another body, there won't be any questions next time. Just silence." He stepped back, let the man stumble toward his truck, then turned and walked away without a glance behind him. The trees took him back in as he moved toward his own truck, the gravel whispering beneath his boots, the blood on his knuckles drying with the night air. He didn't need to write anything down. Every name was already carved into his memory. And now he had a place. The warehouse stood at the edge of nowhere, nestled behind rusted silos and a bend in the road no one used unless they had business worth hiding. It was the kind of place where silence was not just the backdrop, but the language itself, where the rust on the steel siding had been left to deepen like a scar too old to matter. There was no signage, no lighting, no visible cameras, only a half-hung chain on the gate, and tire tracks leading in that had been made too recently to be abandoned. Isaiah didn't park at the gate. He left his truck a full mile down, concealed under an oak-lined ditch behind a row of trees thick enough to swallow headlights. He moved on foot, the early morning air still cool enough to keep his breath shallow, his steps measured in the quiet cadence of someone trained not just to arrive, but to enter, pass through, and leave, with only memory behind. When he reached the side entrance, the lock offered no challenge. He opened it with a twist and stepped inside the dark with the steady control of a man who had never needed light to see clearly. What greeted him was not chaos, but cold order. Rows of crates, makeshift shelving lined with bags, boxes, folded goods, and shallow plastic bins labeled with counties and dates. The air smelled of plastic, old paper, and dust, with an undertone of oil and mildew, like someone had tried to clean a place that still remembered every crime it had sheltered. He walked slowly between the aisles, not looking for confrontation, only confirmation. A stack of ceramic figurines caught his eye, most chipped, some shattered. A box of kitchen tools, mostly dull, lay open beside it. Then, beneath a warped table piled with costume jewelry and small electronics, he saw something that stopped him in place. Her glasses. The left lens still bore the faint hairline crack from where she had dropped them 2 winters ago. The earpiece had that same pink tinge, faded now, but unmistakable. He picked them up gently, turning them over in his hand, his breath quiet but uneven. He didn't speak. He didn't blink. He simply closed his fist around them and slid them into his jacket pocket, without ceremony. Then he poured the gasoline. There was no hesitation as he moved through the structure, marking every aisle, Every crate, every shelf that held pieces of lives stripped from homes just like hers. He moved without anger. Anger was for people with time to burn. Isaiah only had enough time to make sure no one else walked through this place and mistook it for anything less than a burial ground. He lit the match just after sunrise. The fire didn't roar. It crept. It grew quietly, feeding on wood, on cardboard, on photographs, on half-folded receipts and old furniture legs. And then it caught fully and began to consume. He was gone before the roof cracked inward. The smoke spread fast. The fire department responded late, and by the time they arrived, the blaze had taken everything. No alarms had been triggered. No witnesses lingered. But those who were meant to see the message saw it. They felt it. And some of them panicked. By mid-afternoon, word had already moved through the network. Some called it bad luck. Others called it retaliation. But one man didn't wait to see which it was. Reese, a low-level runner, rarely mentioned in the same breath as the core crew, but known to handle pickups, drop-offs, and quiet sales, had disappeared by sunset. He didn't tell anyone. He didn't return home. He packed a single duffel bag, stuffed it with what cash he could grab, and walked to the county bus depot with his hoodie pulled low and his posture stiff from paranoia. He checked over his shoulder 5 times before reaching the curb. Isaiah had already been there for an hour. He watched from a nearby bench, eyes following the gate, the lot, the vending machines that buzzed under the pale yellow lighting. He hadn't known Reese's name. He hadn't needed to. He recognized the instinct. Men who vanish too quickly have stories worth bleeding. When Reese stepped past the second bench, Isaiah stood and followed in silence. He closed the distance just as the man turned his back to fumble with a coin for the soda machine. The hit wasn't fast. It was exact. Isaiah struck the back of Reese's knee with his boot, driving his full weight through the joint, sending the man crumpling forward with a howl of pain that echoed across the lot. Before Reese could roll or recover, Isaiah grabbed the front of his jacket and slammed him into the side of the depot wall, one elbow driving up into his ribs with surgical force that cracked something soft and vital inside. Reese tried to scream again, but Isaiah's hand was already pressed against his throat, not crushing, just reminding him how easy it would be. "I don't care who you are," Isaiah said, voice calm, words shaped like stone. "But I know what you're running from." Reese tried to reply, but Isaiah drove his fist into the man's stomach, forcing the air out of his lungs before he could speak. "You know the warehouse," Isaiah continued, not asking but stating. "You were close enough to run, close enough to fear." Reese coughed blood, nodded quickly, his hand shaking as he tried to lift it in defense. "I didn't do nothing to her, man, I swear. I just handled drops. That's all I ever did." Isaiah grabbed him by the collar again, lifted him halfway to standing, then spun and threw him across the pavement, letting the man skid against the concrete with the sound of denim tearing and skin scraping. "Where is Clay?" Isaiah asked, walking toward him slowly, methodically, as Reese scrambled backward against the bench, trying to push himself upright on a broken leg that no longer held weight. "He's got a place," Reese gasped, eyes wide, spit mixing with blood on his chin. "Out near Miller's Creek, farmhouse behind a burned-out field. No phone lines, no Wi-Fi. Says it keeps him clean. Security? 2 guys maybe, off-duty types, but he doesn't trust them much. Keeps records, real logs, names, payouts. He tracks people, old folks on retirement, single homes, places easy to clean." Isaiah said nothing. He stood over him for a long moment, watching as Reese writhed, one hand still clutching his knee, the other reaching for nothing. "You're done," Isaiah said, voice quiet, not as threat, but truth. "If I see you again, I'll finish what I started." He turned, walked away from the bus depot without looking back, and disappeared into the night as quickly as he'd come. The man had given him everything he needed. Now he had the name, the location, and the evidence to burn it all down again. The sun hadn't risen in 3 towns before Isaiah's name became something no one dared speak aloud. Not because they knew it, but because they feared what came with silence. He didn't arrive like a storm. He moved like a system, slow, exact, and methodical in his ruin. No social media posts marked his presence. No news articles chronicled his violence. There were no warnings, no trails, no confessions. Just broken men, quiet disappearances, and an unspoken certainty that someone out there had begun tearing through the gang from the inside out. It started with a man named Cutter. He wasn't part of the core. He ran tools mostly, stolen drills, saws, equipment taken from garages left cracked open in the night. He thought he'd gotten out clean after the warehouse fire, thought the heat would die down if he kept his head low. But Isaiah found him behind the back exit of a pawn shop in Alton, stepping out with a bag full of merchandise tagged from 3 counties. He didn't approach with rage. He approached in silence, his steps measured, the tension in his shoulders completely relaxed. Not from peace, but from certainty. Cutter noticed too late. Isaiah had already driven him face first into the trunk of his own car by the time his hand reached for the weapon tucked beneath his shirt. There was no yelling, no flourish. Isaiah dislocated Cutter's shoulder with a snap that echoed through the alley, then forced him to the ground with one knee pressed against the back of his neck. When the questions came, they weren't shouted. They were spoken in the low, clear tone of someone who expected answers because the alternative had already been measured and prepared. Isaiah didn't need a name from him. He needed the connection, the pipeline, the meeting spots, the collection houses, and Cutter, choking on blood and snot, gave up everything in under 10 minutes. Isaiah took photos of what he found in the trunk: pill bottles, fake IDs, a folder of elderly homeowners with notes scribbled in the margins: widowed, no security, garden tools visible, easy entry. He didn't call the police. He left Cutter cuffed to the iron fence behind the pawn shop and disappeared into the night. The next was Mace. He worked cash drop-offs, small-town enforcer who fancied himself tougher than he was. Isaiah found him at a roadside bar east of Hollow Ridge, mouthing off to a waitress who had already told him twice she wasn't interested. Isaiah waited until he staggered out to relieve himself behind the dumpsters, then grabbed him by the collar, spun him around, and delivered 3 calculated blows to the abdomen and 1 across the throat. Not enough to crush the trachea, but enough to drop him flat. Mace didn't talk until his left wrist bent the wrong way, and even then he tried to posture. Isaiah didn't indulge him. He forced the man to recite names, payment cycles, dates of planned hits, and who they'd paid off in the last 6 months to keep patrols away from certain neighborhoods. Then he took a photo of the man's busted face, documented the money transfers on a burner phone pulled from Mace's pocket, and erased the rest. Mace was found 2 hours later, tied to a park bench with a note duct-taped to his chest. "This is for the quiet ones, for the ones you thought no one would miss." The message spread. Not on paper, not online, but through the kind of channels used by cowards and criminals. Coded calls, encrypted threads, whispered warnings traded behind car windows. Each man taken wasn't just wounded. He was emptied, made to relive every act he thought would never find consequence, every home he'd violated, every face he'd laughed at on the way out. The bodies didn't pile up. Isaiah wasn't reckless. He wasn't a murderer, but he was a reckoning, one that took its time. Back in the hills, in a farmhouse nestled behind a field of wild grass and dying fence posts, Clay Barger watched the threads of his operation fray in real time. He sat in a dark den, a laptop open, a digital map on the screen lit with markers that had once meant revenue and now meant risk. Clay had always considered himself smart. Smarter than the brutes he hired. Smarter than the police who barely blinked at the reports. Smarter even than the system that made his entire enterprise possible. He had planned his network with precision, chosen his victims with logic, and stayed just distant enough from the front lines to keep his hands technically clean. But the pattern unfolding now was different. This wasn't police work. This wasn't rival turf war. The hits were too clean, too exact, and too personal. Whoever was moving through his crew wasn't sending a message to the organization. He was sending a message to him. Clay clicked through one of the photos he'd received that morning. Mace, bloodied, hand splinted crudely, eyes swollen shut. The message on his chest was what caught Clay's attention. The quiet ones. Clay sat back, fingers steepled, the room around him empty of sound. That phrase meant something. He opened a file cabinet beneath the desk, rifled through folders until he found the address. Old lady on the edge of town. Esther Bell, solo occupant. Minimal security. Payout marginal, but clean. He remembered the house, remembered the silence that followed. The report had said she fought back. The report had also said she had a son. His fingers paused. He stared at the name for a long moment. Then he closed the drawer. The silence he'd been counting on to protect him was gone now. And somewhere beyond his land, Isaiah was already on his way, moving through the fields with the quiet discipline of someone who had planned this not out of rage, but out of purpose. He wasn't chasing vengeance. He wasn't burning things to feel alive. He was finishing a list, and Clay had just realized his name was on it. The fire at the warehouse hadn't made the news, but the smoke had reached City Hall. Not through reporters, not through police reports, but through the kind of anxious backroom whispers that circulate when systems built on silence begin to crack. Someone had burned a supply hub to the ground. Someone had crippled half a crew without leaving a body. Someone had started asking questions in places that had stayed comfortably unanswered for years. Sheriff Wyatt Colton heard it first from a town councilman who didn't so much ask a question as he issued a concern. A polite, carefully worded observation about tensions rising and an outsider making rounds. The sheriff hadn't missed the warning behind the words. When he asked what the council wanted him to do about it, they didn't give a direct answer. They didn't have to. Quiet was the goal. As long as the town remained still on paper, everything else could be managed. But Colton was no fool. He knew the fire wasn't a coincidence, just like he knew the men turning up bruised, bloodied, or vanished hadn't been mugged. It didn't take much effort to trace the timeline, and it took even less to realize the one man who hadn't left town since the day of the funeral, the one whose truck now appeared regularly outside a home that should have been sold, wasn't just grieving. He was hunting. So Colton started asking around. He didn't use Isaiah's name at first. He just described him vaguely, a former military type, someone asking too many questions. He kept the tone casual, as if it were a passing curiosity. But the answers he got made it clear it was already too late. The neighbors had seen him. The bars had noticed him, and none of them had stopped him. Not because they supported him, but because they were afraid. By the end of the week, Colton drove out himself. He parked in front of Esther Bell's home just after dusk, stepping out with his hat tucked low and his belt sitting a little heavier than usual. He didn't approach with authority. He approached like a man who'd already read the report and knew he hadn't done enough. Isaiah opened the door before he knocked. The look he gave wasn't angry. It was worse than that. It was precise, cold, measured. "You need to leave town," Colton said without wasting time. "This place is getting smaller and people are noticing." Isaiah leaned against the frame, one hand resting just out of sight. "You noticed when they killed her?" he asked, voice calm. Colton didn't answer. "You take down any plates? Collect any statements? Or did you file that one straight into the drawer and wait for the dirt to cover it?" Colton sighed. his boots shifting against the gravel. "What you're doing, it's not justice." "I'm not looking for justice," Isaiah said, voice flat. "I'm looking for facts. I understand you're angry." "No," Isaiah said, his eyes narrowing. "Angry was 3 weeks ago. This is something else." Colton adjusted his hat and looked past Isaiah into the dark house, then nodded once. "You've made your point," he said quietly. "Now let it be." Isaiah didn't reply. He closed the door. But later that night, when the town had gone quiet again, when the sheriff's cruiser had returned to its lot, and the lights above the station flickered under tired wiring, Isaiah came back. Not as a visitor, not as a citizen, but as a ghost. He moved through the alley behind the sheriff's office with the ease of someone who had studied every camera angle, timed every patrol car, and already mapped out the lock rotation on the back gate. The door gave after 3 seconds. The inner hallway was dark, the desk lamp left on by a deputy too tired to finish the shift. Isaiah didn't hesitate. He slipped past the front room, into the records office, and closed the door behind him. The filing cabinets were old, labeled by year. He ignored the digital terminal entirely. He knew better than to trust a system with a delete key. What he needed was still on paper, buried because someone had wanted it forgotten, not removed. And sure enough, in the drawer marked 2023, Missing Complaints, he found her name. Esther Bell. 4 entries. 3 phone calls, 1 walk-in, descriptions in brief language, possible trespassers posing as utility workers, unmarked vehicle parked near property multiple times, unknown individuals knocking after dark. Each report had been stamped with the same outcome. No further action required. There were no follow-ups, no interviews, no photographs, no notes. Isaiah read them twice, then laid them on the desk beside the faded station calendar. He opened another folder labeled Internal Complaints. 1 entry stood out, handwritten, dated months earlier. It mentioned multiple calls from the same street. Elderly residents reporting strangers watching their homes. The name of 1 deputy had been circled 3 times in red ink. He took a photo of each page, sliding them back into their folders exactly as they were. He left no fingerprints, no scratches, no mess. He didn't want to raise alarms. He wanted them to sleep through the realization of what he had taken until it was already too late to stop it. When he returned home, he laid the photos out on the floor. His mother had called, not out of panic or confusion, but with the clarity of someone who knew the difference between something that felt wrong and something that was wrong. She had reported what she saw. Unmarked trucks lingering too long at the curb. Unfamiliar men in reflective vests knocking without reason. The unsettling stillness that followed after she turned them away. And she had trusted that putting her voice on record would mean something to the people who were supposed to listen. The reports weren't imagined. They weren't theoretical. They were written down in pen and dated, then filed away in drawers that had never once been opened to follow through. She had reached for help, and in return, she had been logged and forgotten. The failure wasn't born from ignorance. It was born from a decision, from a quiet, deliberate choice to treat her concerns as unworthy of urgency, to dismiss her presence as one more aging voice on a street the town had already decided didn't matter. The truth sat plainly in Isaiah's hands now. Photographs of complaints, transcripts of ignored warnings, and a complete absence of action from men who had every opportunity to do the smallest thing that might have saved her life. They hadn't just failed her by inaction. They had erased her by design, excusing their silence with the same language that had buried countless others before her. Isaiah remained seated on the floor for a long while, surrounded by the weight of paper that should have protected her. The soft lamplight casting long, tired shadows across the pages and the hardwood beneath him. The room, once hers, now carried the shape of absence in every corner. The chair where she read, the window she used to crack open when the weather turned, the hallway she had walked with quiet strength long after her body began to slow. None of it offered comfort now. None of it could make the weight lighter. But the facts, stamped, signed, and buried, offered something else. They gave structure to the rage. They gave names to the silence. They gave reason to the storm already building inside him. It did not make the grief easier to bear. It did not offer peace or closure or the imagined relief that comes with understanding, but it replaced the blur of what-ifs with a sharper edge, one that cut clean, not with vengeance, but with clarity. There were more names now, more men who had hidden behind distance and badges and handshakes exchanged in back rooms, more voices that had chosen to stay still while hers was silenced. And in the long stretch of night that followed, Isaiah no longer carried the burden of uncertainty. What he held now was something colder, heavier, and far more dangerous. The knowledge that everything she had feared had been real, that everything she had warned them about had been true, and that every soul who could have stopped it had done nothing, not because they couldn't, but because they never intended to. What lay ahead wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about anger anymore. It was about balance, and every step he would take from this moment forward would be measured with the precision of someone who had nothing left that could be taken from him. The field that stretched out behind Miller's Creek was quiet in the way forgotten places often were. Long grass whispering under the weight of wind, fence posts leaning like old men too tired to stand straight, and the smell of damp earth rising from the ground like breath from a hidden mouth. Isaiah stood at the edge of that field, his boots sinking slightly into the soil as he looked out across the wide plain toward the house that sat crookedly against the tree line. The farmhouse wasn't much. One story, tin roof, shutters half-hinged, and windows clouded with dust, but it had the air of something wrong, something buried just beneath the floorboards, waiting to be dug up. He didn't sneak in. He walked. Each step was slow, deliberate, his breath even, the rifle strapped across his back untouched. This wasn't a mission. This wasn't a siege. This was something quieter, something older. The last page of a long chapter written in names and silence and blood. As he crossed the final stretch of grass, he saw Clay Barger step out from the side of the house. No guards, no panic. Just a man holding a cigarette between two fingers, his stance casual, his eyes unreadable. He wore a faded jacket, the collar frayed, boots scuffed and unlaced, like he hadn't planned to leave the place even if he could. Behind him, the door to the cellar stood open, a dark mouth yawning beneath the porch steps, and from where Isaiah stood, he could see the faint glint of metal shelving below. Records, likely, or weapons, or whatever else Clay had been too arrogant to burn. Clay didn't speak at first. He took a slow drag from his cigarette, then exhaled the smoke like a man who still thought he had the advantage. "I heard about Reese," he said. "Heard about the warehouse. You've been busy." Isaiah stopped 10 feet away, hands at his sides, shoulders loose. He didn't answer. Clay nodded slightly, as if that had been expected. "Look," he said, "I don't blame you. She was your mother. I get it. You want someone to answer for what happened. But this," he gestured around him, toward the empty land, the sagging porch, the broken path that led to nowhere. This was never personal. It was just business, just easy. Still, Isaiah didn't move. Clay shifted, flicking the cigarette into the dirt and grinding it beneath his boot. "You think I started this?" he continued. "You think this town didn't offer it up on a plate? You think the sheriff didn't know? The neighbors? Hell, half of them looked the other way before we even stepped on the porch. We didn't force anything. We just walked through doors that were already open." Isaiah's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. "You want me to say it was wrong?" Clay asked, his voice rising slightly. "Fine. It was wrong. It was cruel. But don't come here pretending like I'm the only one who made this place rot. I didn't build the system. I just used it." Isaiah took one step forward, slow and final. Clay's face twitched. Not fear exactly, but awareness. "All right then," he muttered, tossing his jacket to the ground. "I guess we're past talking." And then he moved, fast. Clay charged low, hoping to catch Isaiah off balance, his fists up, his stance wild, but practiced in the way of someone who had survived more brawls than battles. But Isaiah didn't flinch. He pivoted hard to the left, his forearm catching Clay's neck and redirecting the momentum past him. Clay stumbled, caught himself, and spun back with a right hook meant to break bone. Isaiah ducked it. His fist came up under Clay's ribs with a thud that knocked the air from the man's lungs, and before Clay could retreat, Isaiah grabbed his collar, yanked him forward, and slammed his knee into the man's gut with a precision that had nothing to do with rage and everything to do with training. Clay grunted, doubled over, and twisted violently, throwing Isaiah off just enough to stagger him back a step. Clay lunged again, this time tackling Isaiah around the waist, and the two of them went down in a crash of limbs and dirt, fists flying, elbows landing wherever they could connect. Clay's knuckles grazed Isaiah's jaw, but Isaiah answered with a sharp strike to the side of Clay's head that left the man blinking. They rolled once, twice, each trying to gain the top position, but Isaiah broke free and rose first, his chest heaving, sweat slicking his forehead. Clay scrambled up, spitting blood, a grin flickering at the edge of his mouth, like he still believed he could turn this. "You fight like a soldier," he said, circling now, his fists raised again. "But this ain't war. This is dirt. You bleed the same as any of us." Isaiah didn't speak. He just stepped forward again. They met in the center of the field, the sun bleeding into the horizon behind them, casting long shadows that stretched toward the house like ghosts reaching for something lost. Clay struck high, aiming for the face, but Isaiah caught the wrist mid-swing, turned it outward, and slammed his palm against Clay's elbow in one clean motion that snapped the joint with a sound that ended whatever pride the man had left. Clay screamed, tried to swing with the other hand, but Isaiah ducked, twisted, and delivered a brutal strike to the base of Clay's spine that dropped him to one knee. Still, Clay fought. With his good arm, he surged upward, throwing a desperate punch that caught Isaiah across the cheek and drew blood. But Isaiah didn't even blink. He grabbed Clay by the collar, lifted him off the ground, and drove him backward against the trunk of a low, twisted tree at the edge of the clearing. Clay's head snapped back against the bark, dazed, and Isaiah stepped back, waiting. Clay stumbled forward, his body shaking, one arm limp at his side, the other clutched across his ribs. He looked up, eyes unfocused. "This wasn't supposed to happen," he said quietly. "She wasn't supposed to die." But Isaiah no longer heard him. He was already moving again. The second wind came not from strategy or strength, but from the place in Isaiah's chest where grief and rage had collapsed into one another, forming something sharper than either, something that did not burn, but cut. He watched Clay stagger, blood trailing from his mouth, one eye swelling, the left side of his jaw already purpling beneath the bone. Still, Clay stayed on his feet, shoulders rising and falling as he tried to square his stance again, one arm limp, the other trembling as it lifted back into guard. "You think killing me fixes this?" Clay spat, slurring now, barely able to stand. "You think this makes her come back?" Isaiah didn't answer. He stepped in. The punch landed clean against Clay's ribs, and Isaiah followed it instantly with an elbow across his temple, then a knee to the gut that forced the air from Clay's lungs in a soundless exhale. The man dropped, but Isaiah grabbed him mid-fall and drove his back against the tree again, held him there with one hand at his collar while the other delivered another blow, then another, until Clay's legs gave way and his weight slumped forward into Isaiah's chest. But Isaiah didn't let him fall. He shoved him backward, let Clay drop to the dirt in a heap, then circled slowly, breathing through his nose, blood dripping from the corner of his mouth, sweat streaking down his brow. His fists clenched and unclenched, not out of hesitation, but from the force of trying to hold back the part of himself that wanted to end it now, to break something that could never be unbroken. Clay rolled onto his side, groaning. She wasn't supposed to be home, he muttered through broken teeth. We were just gonna scare her, push her out, take the house. You know how many people just walk away when we lean hard enough? He tried to sit up, but Isaiah was already there, crouched low, grabbing the front of Clay's shirt and yanking him upright. My mother didn't walk away from anything, Isaiah said, his voice quiet, every syllable so controlled it felt like pressure building in a sealed room. She stood her ground. You made sure that got her killed. Clay swung clumsily. A half punch meant more for pride than pain. But Isaiah deflected it easily, twisted his wrist, and slammed Clay's face back into the dirt. Clay let out a cry, muffled by earth. But Isaiah didn't loosen his grip. He turned Clay over and drove his forearm into his chest, pinning him in place as his other hand landed 2 more strikes across the jaw. Brutal, clean, unrelenting. Each impact echoed louder than the last. Isaiah wasn't fighting a man anymore. He was fighting the night he didn't get to say goodbye. He was fighting the image of her glasses, cracked, tossed into a bin like nothing. He was fighting the sound of her silence, her phone buzzing under the armchair, her hand too far to reach it. Clay's resistance broke then, not just his strength, but the defiance in his eyes, the smugness that had lingered even when his bones gave out. He was sobbing now, whether from pain or realization. Isaiah didn't care. He released him with a final shove, letting the man collapse onto his back, arms splayed, breath hitching in short gasps. The sun had dropped lower now, casting a wide band of orange across the field, making the blood on Clay's face gleam like rusted copper. Isaiah stepped back, chest heaving, fists still clenched, his entire body trembling, not from fatigue, but from the restraint it took not to end it. Clay turned his head, barely able to lift it. His lips parted. I didn't kill her, he rasped. I didn't go inside. But Isaiah had already heard enough. He grabbed the collar of Clay's shirt one last time, lifted him to his knees, and stared directly into the man's ruined face. For a long moment, there was only the sound of the wind moving through the field, the creak of the old house behind them, and the faint whistle of birds retreating into the trees. Then Isaiah leaned in, his voice quiet, firm, final. You sent them! And with that, he drove one last punch into Clay's temple, a punch not wild with rage, but weighted with certainty, and Clay's body dropped limp, collapsing onto the grass like a man made hollow by his own sins. He didn't move again. Isaiah stood over him, his breath slowing, his hands raw, his muscles burning from the length of the fight. But there was no satisfaction in his face, no triumph. Only the stillness of a man who had done what needed to be done, not for revenge, but for balance, for dignity, for the name they had tried to erase in silence. He didn't say a word as he turned away from the body. He didn't look back. There was no speech, no eulogy, no final act of closure to make it clean. Just a field, a broken man, and the weight of justice falling quiet at last. By the time the coroner's van rolled up the dirt path toward the farmhouse behind Miller's Creek, Clay Barger's body had already cooled beneath the shade of the gnarled tree where the final blow had landed. There were no signs of forced entry, no witnesses willing to step forward, and no statements filed that could place Isaiah Bell at the scene. But even in silence, truth has a way of rising, slow, undeniable, and patient enough to find the cracks in any system built on avoidance. The death wasn't ruled as murder. There were too many bruises on Clay's knuckles for that. Too much blood spread between both men to suggest anything but a fight. Self-defense was whispered in the office of the deputy who first arrived. Quiet nods replaced formal charges. No one pressed for more. No one asked where Isaiah had gone, because everyone already knew, and none of them wanted to admit it. Back in town, the warehouse fire was officially declared an accident, though every deputy who read the report saw through it. And when the documentation surfaced weeks later, photographs of stolen items catalogued without police intervention, names attached to cash drops, files that had been hidden beneath the sheriff's own records, it became clear that the rot hadn't just existed in the crew. It had seeped into the very people who had been charged with keeping the peace. Sheriff Wyatt Colton resigned. He called it retirement, blamed the pressure on the department, said he was tired of the politics, tired of being questioned. But everyone knew what it meant. A civilian complaint, attached to a handwritten letter from Isaiah that never reached the press but circulated quietly through the right hands, outlined 4 separate calls made by Esther Bell in the months before her death. Each one logged, each one dismissed. By the time the internal investigation began, 2 deputies had already disappeared. One was caught attempting to flee the state under an alias, driving a stolen vehicle packed with burner phones and a false badge. The other was found in a motel near the county line, trying to scrub hard drives that contained decades of surveillance records and unfiled reports. His arrest didn't make headlines, but it sent a message to anyone watching from the shadows. The gang itself didn't recover. Without Clay's network, without the security of silence and the cover of lazy enforcement, they scattered. Some tried to regroup under new names. Others went back to the towns they came from, pretending they had never worn the patch or handled the money. But every one of them who had been part of what happened to Esther, every man who had stepped foot inside that house, every man who profited from her death, who watched while she fought and begged and still didn't walk away, had already been visited. Some limped, some vanished, and some simply refused to speak about what happened at all. No trial ever came, no formal reckoning in court. But the community changed in quiet ways. Homes that once stayed dark after sunset began turning on their porch lights again. The church congregation, long thinned by fear and indifference, returned one by one, nodding silently to the seat where Esther used to sit. Her name was spoken more now than it ever had been while she lived, spoken not in mourning, but in acknowledgement, in honor, a woman who saw danger coming and still stood at her door. And Isaiah, though no one saw him return, left one final mark before he disappeared again. Beneath the hydrangeas, where the roots had finally begun to reach upward again, a small wooden marker appeared. Not a headstone, not a plaque, just a carved piece of cedar, sanded smooth and sealed against the rain. It bore no dates, no last names, just 3 words burned into the wood with a steady hand. She warned them. No one dared remove it. The town never publicly acknowledged what had happened, but the shifts were real. Funding for oversight appeared where there had once been resistance. Civilian review boards formed. New leadership arrived from outside the county. Officers with real discipline and eyes that didn't slide past black families on their porches began walking the neighborhoods that had long been neglected. Justice had not come in a courtroom. It had come in footsteps across a field, in fists that struck not for rage, but for remembrance, and in the quiet reordering of a place that had once thought it could bury the truth in soft ground and overgrown gardens. Esther Bell's name was no longer just a line on a file. It had become a landmark. And though Isaiah was gone again, no forwarding address, no family left to call, no trace left on any grid, his presence remained in every uneasy glance over a shoulder, in every patrol car that now paused longer at stop signs, in every house where someone finally felt safe enough to sleep with the windows open again. He had not stayed to explain what he did. He had never needed to. The gravel shifted softly beneath Isaiah's boots as he stepped once more onto the land he had not meant to return to. The rhythm of his footsteps quiet but steady as he approached the house that now stood more as memory than home. Time had not been kind to the structure. It had not collapsed, but it had settled into stillness, the porch sagging slightly where her rocking chair used to rest, the siding dulled by sun and silence, the windows now clouded with dust that no hand had reached out to wipe away. The hydrangeas were gone. Not just dead, but uprooted. The beds where she had once crouched with her wide-brimmed hat and gardening gloves now collapsed into uneven ground, the soft order of her care long since overrun by neglect. No one had replanted, no one had tried. Yet, strangely, no one had paved over it either, as if even in absence the ground still belonged to her. He moved up the steps with deliberate calm, his hand brushing the railing that still held the faint groove where her fingers used to rest each time she came outside to check the sky. The door opened easily, and the air inside met him with the stillness of something held in place by memory. The room had not changed. The curtains remained drawn. The furniture wore its quiet, like a coat. There was no scent left, but the atmosphere felt thick with her presence, soft, unwavering, anchored. He walked through the hallway slowly, his fingers grazing the wall that led to her bedroom, pausing once at the framed photograph of their old church group, where her smile had once steadied him through long deployments and uncertain years. He stepped through the doorway to her room, and the sight of the bed, still made, still undisturbed, pulled something deep in his chest that he could no longer brace against. He knelt at the foot of the bed, with the quiet instinct of someone retracing a step he had not realized he needed to take. He lifted the dust skirt and reached beneath with practiced steadiness until his hand found the familiar shape, the worn leather of her old Bible, kept wrapped in a dish towel to protect it from the dust and age. When he drew it out, it fell open in his lap, the pages swollen from years of turning, corners bent, the spine barely holding. There was a photo tucked between the back cover and the final pages, creased, aged, but untouched. It was them. He was in uniform, young, square-shouldered and weary, but smiling. She stood beside him, her arm through his, her hat tilted just slightly against the sun, her eyes bright with a pride so quiet it could never be faked. They stood in front of this very house, the porch freshly painted, the sky behind them deep and wide, as if the world had not yet narrowed. He sat on the edge of the bed, holding the photograph in one hand, the Bible in the other, and for the first time since this began. Not when he buried her, not when he fought clay, not when the justice he carved bled through the town. He let himself feel the full gravity of what was lost. He had returned. He had brought fire, fists, fury. He had torn through every gate meant to keep the truth buried and laid bare the weight of complicity that had nearly swallowed her life in silence. And yet, she wasn't here. She would never be here again. There was no welcome, no voice, no touch of hand against his back to tell him that it was over now. But the absence did not feel hollow, because justice had come, not in headlines or courtrooms, not in parades or polished speeches, but in the simple and final truth that no man who took part in her destruction had walked away untouched. The gang had been dismantled, their hierarchy broken, their silence turned against them. Those who had stood by, neighbors, officers, officials, had been stripped of the cover they thought would protect them forever. The sheriff was gone. His lies were documented. The town's peace no longer stood on a foundation of denial, but on the memory of the woman they ignored until it was too late. And the weight of it all, the years of looking away, the nights filled with footsteps and false promises, had finally come due. Justice had not been loud. but it had been complete. Isaiah sat there for a long while, his shoulders hunched forward, the photograph pressed flat against his thigh. The Bible still open to a page she had marked years ago in fading ink. He did not cry. Not again. He had already left his tears in this house, buried beneath the floorboards, soaked into the grain of the kitchen doorway and the edge of the windowsill where the light still spilled gently in, like it remembered her shape. He rose, with slow, even motion, placed the Bible back beneath the bed with care, and smoothed the corner of the blanket she had always folded with exactness. The picture he kept. It wasn't for the world. It was for him. He left the room without looking back, crossed the hallway one last time, and paused at the door only to feel the weight of the doorknob warm against his palm. The air outside had cooled slightly, the field at the edge of the yard swaying in rhythm with the dusk, and the porch creaked under his feet in a way that made it feel like the house exhaled. He stepped down onto the path, letting the evening light fold around him. There were no reporters, no town officials, no neighbors waiting with quiet thanks. There was only the house, only the land, only her. And in the quiet, Isaiah Bell knew that the fight was over. Not because the wounds were healed, but because the silence had been broken. And that, finally, was enough. I hope you enjoyed that story. Please share it with your friends and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. In the meantime, I have handpicked 2 stories for you that I think you will enjoy. Have a great day.